what's actually been something that you're really passionate about, that you find really interesting or funny, other than Manchester United, that you've not covered before in any sort of interview, speakers event?
I mean, something that I am really passionate about and that I love talking about now, actually. And so what I do now is I'm a speaker, keynote speaker at conferences, and I often do like motivational ones as well, but I also do quite a lot of safety ones. And I'm about to sound probably quite boring now, but one of my real passions is looking at like the human factors training, about how the humans interact within those systems and things like that. So if you think about, you and I, before we went on air, we're just sort of saying, how does a tornado pilot's experiences relate to a sandwich factory in Scunthorpe, for example? But if you actually look at that, processes, protocols, regulations, compliance, all of these words that we think are a bit tedious, they're all the dirty words type thing of like, do we have to? Is it a tick box exercise? When you're looking at a sandwich factory, if they make mistakes, and people actually can get really ill as a consequence. If you're talking about the oil and gas industry, people will die if they get it wrong. So actually these high risk industries, be that the food prep, be that chemical, oil and gas, it doesn't really matter, or healthcare, all of those same lessons apply and can be read across really readily. And I think it's particularly around that human factor. And I love the area where we talk a lot about failure and talking openly about our mistakes, because I think this is something that the aviation world have actually really led on, is the just culture and having a really open and honest reporting culture. And it's an area that is not quite as widely embraced in other organisations and other companies as well, because failure is often seen as a dirty word, isn't it? We don't like to fail. I mean, can you think about, say, you're at school, you do a spelling test, you've got 9 out of 10. And what do your parents or your carers say when you come home? What was the one you got wrong? Okay, because we only ever focus on the negative, isn't it? I got 9 A's and an F. What was your F in? So we always focus on this negative, and that's the failure bit. And so because that failure has always felt like a bad thing, when we then get into the workplace and suddenly now we're in a culture where we say, tell you what, Sam, I really want to know about mistakes that you make. You think, of course you don't. I don't want to talk about mistakes I make, because ultimately, if I got away with it, why would I tell anyone? And it's really important that, we take the work that we've done within aviation, where, in the 1990s, we saw, technology was improving massively, and yet we saw our accident rate going through the roof as well. And we were like, what? This doesn't make sense. Technology should be helping the accident rate to come down. And that's when they realised that one of the comments they were so often hearing on that black box post a crash was, what's it doing now? I'm disconnected from the system. So what they introduced was this crew resource management, human performance factors. And it covered everything from stress, fatigue, threat and error management, culture, communication, decision-making, situational awareness, all of these things. And actually it trained people in it. And it became mandatory in 92 to do an initial course, and then mandatory in 95 to do a recurrent course. So every single pilot, cabin crew, air crew will go through this training as well yearly to remind them of the importance of this human factors training.
That's not boring at all.
You were glazing over, no, well,
Well, I always got to decide what's the best question to ask next, because it is a raw chat. So you say something and I'm like,
yeah,
well, where do we go on from here? But it's what avenue I choose.
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot to discuss.
Yeah.
Is that civilian and military?
Yep. So, I mean, it was brought in originally was for civilian. They led the front on it, actually. And it's now mandatory as well for all military pilots have to go through it too.
It's an interesting subject because, like I mentioned, I was thinking quite a lot of things. One being, I pick my toddler up from nursery and I'm not allowed to use the word naughty. They're not allowed to use the word naughty. But call me old school. I don't know. You get into this kind of age issue, how old we are and what generation we're from, what's okay, what's not okay. Helen said something on the last podcast which was interesting, and it was about failures. Let's assume the commander, I'm just going to say commander because I don't know what the structure is. If someone makes a mistake and then someone else later on down the line makes the same mistake, they'll all be held accountable because they all should have sat down and said, I made this mistake. This is what I did wrong. This is how you rectify it.
Yeah.
And then it shouldn't happen again to anyone else. So even though it's been addressed, you as an individual are at fault in those environments, you should all take it on board. And I thought that was really, really poignant because when I've worked, corporate world, you sit down, you have an appraisal or a performance review, but it's just you and your manager and you talk about your individual performance.
Yeah.
And when do the people actually sit down and go, us as a wider team need to address these things?
And that comes back to the debrief you see as well. So if you think every single flight you ever fly in military or civilian world, you will debrief it afterwards. And it is mandatory. It is as important as the flight itself. And when I speak to businesses and I say, do you debrief? They go, oh, not as often as we should. We just never have time. And they certainly don't in the medical world either. And you think, well, if you don't make time, how do you ever learn? You know, you want to be these high-performing teams. You want to be agile, adaptable, all of these great buzzwords. But if you're not actually putting any time to say what went well, what went badly, and what could I do more of, then how are you ever going to grow? And I think that whole point there that you said that Helen had mentioned as well, I think is really, really important. And the point there is, how many times would if you ever hear yourself saying, I could have told you that would happen. If you could have told me it was going to happen then, why didn't you? And that is the whole point. If you ever hear yourself saying that, it's about actually saying something, you know, and they talk about this. I did a really interesting session with the police force actually, and I loved it. And I sat up at the start and I said, it was to about 100 senior police officers from lots and lots of different areas. And at the start I said, who has made a mistake that they want to chat about? And there was like tumbleweed. And I just let this tumbleweed blow. I wanted the silence. I wanted it to be really uncomfortable. And it was really uncomfortable. And I let it become really uncomfortable. And I said, okay, obviously no one's feeling open enough to talk. And then we started to talk about there's been so many studies that have been done when you look at industrial accidents, aviation accidents, and we always get this same structure. For every one crash, one big event, loss of life, you will have 30 minor events where an incident went in, where that could be, let's say in the workplace, that could be a loss of a limb or a slip disc. Sorry, Sam. You know, or it could be an injury, but a report went in. But beneath your waterline, there will be 300 near misses where people got away with it, where they don't have to put a report in, and some of the times they don't bother. If you're only getting information about the 1 and the 30, you are missing this enormous database of the potential incidents that could be happening. So you're always going to be reactive. So if you can actually build trust within your organization where people talk openly about their 300 events, then ultimately you're creating a proactive learning culture. Now that takes time to build, of course it does. So we had an entire session with the police. It was about over 2 hours. Lots of stuff was talked about. And the very last thing I said was, okay, on your tables, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to talk about any really good 300 events that you've had that you want to share. I couldn't stop them talking. We had to extend the session. We went straight into the lunch break, another half an hour, and we're like, I really think we should go for lunch. Because ultimately, there were so many wonderful 300 events they wanted to share that right at the end, I said, thank you for sharing all your mistakes. We have now got them captured. And they all sort of went, oh my God, they are our mistakes. But all we had done was reframe the language. And so if you are in a leadership position, you know, when we talk about what makes a good leader and all of those sorts of aspects, to me, it's about authenticity. It's about being vulnerable. It's about showing that you do make mistakes. And if you look at, say, the Red Arrows, my very last flight in a military aircraft was with the Red Arrows. And I flew 3 sorties with them. And it was an absolutely phenomenal day. I thought I knew about flying and it was just absolutely brilliant. But what I loved more than anything was the debrief and the honesty that Red 1 displayed when he stood up. And you had all of these civilians at the back who'd won this raffle prize and could come and watch some Red Arrows fly. And I was having the excitement of flying with them. And instantly Red 1 said, okay, did anyone spot my first mistake? And he showed vulnerability. And in doing so, you're setting the tone from the top that others want to follow. And I think just by having that open dialogue, therefore, about mistakes, you're entire culture starts to change. And after that event with the police, I went into about 4 different stations afterwards, and there was a triangle on their board when you first walked into the station, and it just had 130, 300. 300 was circled and said, what's been your latest 300 event? And I was like, oh my God, they said, we're opening our meetings by asking that question. That to me shows a growth mindset, and that's really, really powerful.